Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, hunter of lions. Originally not meant to inherit the throne, Ashurbanipal distinguished himself as one of the greatest kings of the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal ruled the Assyrian Empire from 669 BCE, 627 BC, and he is thought to be one of the last great kings of Assyria. As a younger son, he was never meant to inherit the throne. However, the young prince so distinguished himself that his father split his kingdom to ensure that Ashurbanipal would be his successor. Records of Ashurbanipal's reign depict a ruler who was both a ruthless warrior and a dedicated scholar. Although he had a significant impact on Mesopotamian history, he garners much less attention than other kings from the region, and he is often referred to as one of history's greatest forgotten kings. The Assyrian Empire originally began as a small city-state under the Akkadian Empire, which dominated Mesopotamia from 2334–2154 BC. After the collapse of the Akkadians, Assyria gradually emerged as an independent political power around the 14th century BCE. Roughly 200 years later, Assyria would suffer a major administrative collapse and lose much of its territory. In the 9th century BC, about 300 years after its collapse, the Assyrian Empire would re-emerge as a dominant power in Mesopotamia and reclaim its lost lands. By the 7th century BC, it had reached the peak of its power, becoming the largest empire in the ancient world. Although the Assyrian Empire began as an Akkadian society, it incorporated several ancient cultures into its social structure as it expanded. Subsequently, Assyria also became one of the most diverse empires in Mesopotamian history. To govern its many regions, the empire was split into designated provinces overseen by governors. In turn, these governors were accountable to the king. The Assyrians were heavily reliant on military force to maintain control over their vassals and in order to continue expanding their borders. Consequently, the Assyrian Empire dedicated much of its resources to developing military innovations and perfecting the art of psychological warfare, developing into one of the most warlike civilizations in Mesopotamia, often referred to as the first military power in history. Ashurbanipal was born in 685 BC to Esarhaddon, king of Assyria. Mesopotamian texts do not specify his place in the line of succession, but surviving records indicate that he likely had 3 older brothers, as well as 1 older sister, and several younger brothers. In 674 BC, Ashurbanipal's eldest brother and the crown prince of the Assyrian Empire suddenly died. Concerned that there would be competition over the succession, Esarhaddon decided to make Ashurbanipal heir to Assyria. Simultaneously, Esarhaddon decreed that his eldest surviving son would become heir to Babylonia. Although this effectively split his empire, Esarhaddon drew up a treaty to secure his plan for the succession. This treaty, often referred to as the Succession Treaty, compelled Assyrian vassals to swear oaths of fealty to both sons and to support their claims to their respective thrones. Following Esarhaddon's decree, Ashurbanipal underwent intensive training to be the future king of Assyria. Like other Assyrian kings, his instruction emphasized military skill, and the young prince was educated in melee combat, archery, horseback riding, and chariot riding. To prove his military prowess, he was expected to hunt lions, and the prince performed so well that he was referred to as the hunter of lions in Mesopotamian texts. Unlike most Assyrian kings, he was also given an academic education by court scholars, who taught the prince to read and write. Ashurbanipal also received extensive political training and even helped to manage his father's network of spies, which allowed him to increase his knowledge of the Assyrian Empire and to learn about his political enemies. When Esarhaddon left for his military campaigns, Ashurbanipal ran the court in his father's absence. Esarhaddon died in 669 BC, and the succession proceeded as he instructed. Esarhaddon's eldest surviving son, Ḥᴁ ruled over the region of Babylonia, while Ashurbanipal inherited control of the remaining Assyrian Empire. Soon after becoming king, he put an end to Assyria's ongoing war with Egypt and added yet another region to his already massive empire. Following this victory, Ashurbanipal continued the expansionist efforts of his predecessors by waging war with a number of civilizations, such as the Phoenicians and Urartu. One of his most important victories was against the kingdom of Elam, with whom Assyria had battled for centuries until the great king conquered them. Early into his reign, he also put down a number of uprisings from regions that had been recently conquered by his father and still balked at Assyrian rule. In addition to his successes, Ashurbanipal's military career was defined by the complete ruthlessness that he showed his enemies. After his armies conquered a region, the king subjected them to heavy plundering and taxation. Defeated populations were often forced to leave their homelands, relocating to other regions of the Assyrian Empire, where they were incorporated into the vast workforce that kept the empire running. Healthy men were also obligated to serve in the Assyrian army. Prisoners of war were subjected to brutal execution methods, such as having their tongues removed and being flayed alive. Some were even put through psychological torture, such as being forced to grind the bones of their dead parents, which they believed would have kept their spirits from resting. The king was equally brutal to enemy leaders, subjecting them to public executions or humiliating punishments such as being chained up like a dog outside the gates of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. As planned by Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal ruled over the majority of the Assyrian Empire. The region of Babylonia was excluded from his control, as Ashurbanipal's older brother, Shamash-Shum-ukin, ruled this portion of the empire. While the two kings appear to have cooperated initially, records indicate that the relationship between Ashurbanipal and his brother soured over time. The exact nature of the conflict is unclear, but records suggest that Ashurbanipal may have tried to control Shamash-Shum-ukin's administration, treating him more like a subordinate governor than a fellow king. In stark contrast, Mesopotamian texts indicate that Ashurbanipal perceived himself as a benevolent king who supported his brother by giving him resources, such as armies and vassals, that were essential to his kingdom. Predictably, the mounting tensions between the two brothers eventually culminated into open conflict. In 652 BC, Shamash-Shum-ukin formed an alliance with several of Ashurbanipal's discontent vassals and started a rebellion against his brother. Shamash-Shum-ukin's revolt lasted 3 years and almost all the southern Assyrian Empire joined the Babylonian army. Despite this, Ashurbanipal and his supporters drove the revolution back, and would eventually lay siege to the city of Babylon for 2 years. Records of the siege indicate that the situation inside Babylon became so dire that parents cannibalized their own children to avoid starvation. Shamash-Shum-ukin died in Babylon when his palace caught fire, possibly in an act of suicide by the king, who would have known what fate awaited him if he was captured. Having lost their king, the Babylonians surrendered.